She looked out the airport window as the sunrise painted the sky with soft orange light. Her flight number flashed on the big blue screen above the gate, showing on time. She took a slow breath and checked her ticket again. Seat 16A. Window seat. She liked that. It gave her a place to disappear, a quiet corner where she could watch the clouds and let her thoughts drift. The airport was already alive with sounds, rolling suitcases, coffee machines, and the hum of early travelers. She moved through the line calmly, holding only a small backpack. Her clothes were simple, jeans, a light gray hoodie, and sneakers. She looked like any other passenger heading out for work or maybe to visit family. No one could have guessed what she really did for a living or what kind of weight she carried behind her calm eyes. When she finally reached the plane door, the flight attendant greeted her with a practiced smile. "Good morning, welcome aboard." She nodded politely and stepped inside. The air inside the cabin was cooler, filled with that familiar scent of coffee and recycled air. She found her seat quickly, 16A, near the wing. She slid into it, rested her backpack under the seat, and closed her eyes for a moment. It had been 3 months since her last flight, but this one felt different. It wasn't a military aircraft roaring off a runway. It was a quiet commercial flight. No mission briefings, no helmet, no radio chatter. Just a plane full of strangers heading to Washington, D.C. She glanced out the window. The sun was higher now, glowing on the tarmac. Ground crew workers in neon vests moved like tiny figures, waving orange wands, guiding other planes into position. It was almost peaceful to watch. When the engine started to hum, the noise grew louder, steady, rhythmic. The plane began to roll back slowly, and she felt that small pull in her chest, the feeling of leaving something behind. She hadn't told anyone what flight she was taking. She never did. Not because of secrecy or habit, but because she liked the silence. When people found out she was in the Air Force, the conversation always changed. Questions followed. Curiosity, admiration, sometimes disbelief. It was easier to keep things quiet, to just be another passenger. The man in the aisle seat smiled at her as he sat down. "Morning," he said. "Morning," she replied softly, returning the smile. He looked friendly, probably mid-40s with a kind face and a laptop bag. The type of person who would chat about sports or family or how expensive airport coffee had become. She didn't mind small talk, but she hoped he wouldn't ask too many questions. As the plane taxied to the runway, she put in her earbuds and played soft music. It helped drown out the world. The engines roared to life, pressing everyone gently into their seats. She loved that moment, the sudden rush, the vibration through the floor, the feeling of flight beginning. Even after years of being a pilot, there was still magic in it. Through the window, she watched the ground shrink away. Cars became dots. Buildings turned into shapes. The sky opened wide, endless and blue. Somewhere above 20,000 feet, the seatbelt sign went off. People started reaching for their bags, adjusting their seats and whispering to one another. A baby cried softly a few rows back. The flight attendants moved down the aisle with coffee and snacks. She ordered tea, thanked the attendant, and went back to staring out the window. That's when she caught her reflection in the glass, calm, almost unreadable. It surprised her sometimes how different she looked from how she felt inside. There was a tiredness there, but also something steadier, something trained. Her phone buzzed once on airplane mode. A scheduled reminder flashed briefly before disappearing. It was for something small, a note about her next base check-in. Even off-duty, reminders like that followed her. The man beside her spoke again, friendly as before. "Heading home or heading out?" She hesitated.
"Heading out," she said simply. "Business trip?"
He asked. "Something like that," he nodded, taking the hint. "I'm going to D.C. for a conference. Feels like I live on planes lately." She smiled politely. "Yeah, I know the feeling." He went back to his laptop, and she was grateful for the quiet again. She leaned her head against the cool window and watched the clouds pass like soft waves. It had been months since she left the base. After years of missions, noise, and responsibility, the silence of civilian travel still felt strange. Sometimes it almost made her uneasy, as if she should be doing something more. Listening to radio traffic, scanning radar ready for orders, but today, she told herself, she was just another traveler. At least, that's what she believed then. The captain's voice came over the intercom, calm and steady. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've reached our cruising altitude of 36,000 feet. Weather looks clear all the way to Washington. Sit back and relax. People murmured in response, a few claps here and there. She smiled faintly and sipped her tea. Then she closed her eyes. Her mind drifted back to the sky she truly knew, the one above the desert. The roar of the Raptor engines, the heavy oxygen mask pressing against her face. There was no passenger service there, no smiling attendants. Just open air, radio calls, and the quiet voice of command in her headset. She remembered one mission in particular, the one that still woke her up at night sometimes. She had led a flight over the coast during a tense operation. It wasn't supposed to be dangerous, but it turned fast. A radar anomaly, an unresponsive aircraft, an emergency maneuver that could have gone wrong. It was the moment she'd earned her call sign, Valkyrie. The name stuck. It wasn't glamorous. It was a reminder of responsibility, of lives protected. She didn't talk about that day. Not with anyone. And now, sitting in seat 16A, she told herself she had left all that behind, just for one flight. The cabin lights dimmed slightly. The attendants rolled carts quietly. The hum of the engines turned into a kind of soft lullaby. Outside, the sky deepened to a richer blue. Thin streaks of clouds drifted below them. Somewhere far beneath, entire towns and cities passed unseen. She felt herself finally start to relax. The man beside her had fallen asleep, his laptop closed, arms folded. The row across the aisle was filled with a young couple whispering and laughing quietly. A woman near the back was reading a thick novel. Everyone seemed peaceful, unaware of how fragile that peace could be. She tilted her head slightly, looking down at the wings. She could read the airflow just by watching the flaps. Old habits. She smiled faintly at the thought. Then a light flickered above. Nothing strange, just turbulence maybe. The plane shuddered slightly, then steadied. The captain's voice came on again, a bit firmer this time. Folks, we're going to experience a little bit of rough air for the next few minutes. Please return to your seats and fasten your belts. A few people shifted, some nervous laughter. She buckled up without thinking. It wasn't the bumps that bothered her. It was the tone in the captain's voice, something cautious, something controlled. Years of flying had taught her to recognize that tone. She looked out again. The clouds below were thicker now, gray at the edges. The plane leveled off again, but she couldn't shake the small feeling in her gut. Something off. Not danger, just off. Her instincts were rarely wrong. Still, she took a breath, told herself not to overthink it, and went back to the view. The horizon stretched endless, quiet, perfect. For the next half hour, everything felt normal again. People talked softly. Flight attendants smiled, and the air smoothed out. She even started to drift toward sleep. But deep down, a pilot's senses never really turn off. She kept noticing things. The faint sound of radio static from the cockpit, the way the plane adjusted course slightly, the momentary change in engine pitch. Small things most passengers would never notice. She pressed her hand lightly to the armrest, feeling the vibration through her palm. It told her more than instruments ever could. Everything felt fine, but still, something about the rhythm had changed. She glanced at her watch, then at the reflection of the sky in the window. It was beautiful, so peaceful it almost felt unreal. Somewhere in the back of her mind, though, a quiet voice whispered the same reminder she had heard before every mission. Stay alert. Always. And though she didn't know it yet, the next few hours would test that instinct more than any mission she'd ever flown. At that moment, she was still just the quiet woman in seat 16A. But soon, the world above the clouds would remember her call sign again. The sky outside had turned from a soft blue to a pale gray. The sunlight filtered through the thin layer of clouds, giving everything a hazy glow. The woman in seat 16A took another slow sip of her tea, now lukewarm, and glanced around the cabin. Everything seemed calm. Too calm. The passengers around her looked relaxed. Some scrolled through their phones on airplane mode. Others read magazines or dozed off with their heads resting on the seatbacks. The man beside her was still sleeping, his mouth slightly open, the rhythm of his breathing steady. The flight attendants were chatting softly near the galley, one of them quietly laughing at something the other said. But beneath all that quiet, something felt different. She couldn't explain it at first. It wasn't fear or panic. It was just a feeling, the kind that comes from years of flying and noticing details others miss. Maybe it was the way the plane slightly changed its course, the subtle dip she felt when the engines adjusted power, or the fact that the captain hadn't spoken for a long time. Usually, pilots gave small updates along the way. She checked her watch again. By now, they should have crossed into the airspace where commercial routes often changed direction before descending toward the capital, but the timing didn't feel right. A small ripple of turbulence made the wings tremble outside her window. Nothing serious, but enough to draw her attention. Then the intercom crackled. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking." There was a pause. Too long of a pause. His tone was calm, but she could hear the tightness beneath it. That practiced voice pilots use when something isn't quite routine. "We've been instructed to hold at our current altitude due to temporary airspace restrictions. It's nothing to be concerned about. We'll have more information shortly." Then the intercom clicked off. A few passengers exchanged confused looks. A woman across the aisle asked her husband what that meant. He shrugged, already pulling out his phone as if he could check something from 36,000 feet. The woman in 16A stayed still. Her eyes narrowed slightly as she looked out the window. Temporary airspace restrictions weren't unusual near Washington, but something about this situation didn't fit. She could tell by the direction of the sun that they were holding farther west than they should have been. Her instincts whispered again. Something's wrong. She looked toward the front of the plane. One of the flight attendants was on the interphone, speaking quietly, her expression serious now. The other attendant had stopped smiling and was glancing down the aisle nervously. She unbuckled her seatbelt slowly and leaned toward the aisle, trying not to draw attention. Through the window on the opposite side, she caught a faint flash of movement. At first, it looked like sunlight reflecting off another aircraft, but then she saw it more clearly. A small silhouette in the distance, moving fast and steady. Her breath caught for a moment. That wasn't another passenger plane. The shape was too sleek, too angular. She knew that outline by heart. It was a fighter jet. She blinked, making sure she wasn't mistaken. But no. The glint of metal wings, the faint vapor trail cutting through the sky, and it was there, following them. Her mind started working fast, trained and sharp. Civilian airliners rarely had escort traffic anywhere near them, especially not F-22s. If one was flying this close, it meant the military had either detected a threat or lost communication with this aircraft. Neither was good. She pressed her lips together, trying to stay calm. A few rows up, someone pointed out the window, whispering to their seatmate. "Is that a jet?" She could hear the faint nervousness creeping into people's voices. The passengers were starting to notice. Within minutes, the calm bubble of the cabin began to change. People were murmuring, twisting in their seats to look out the windows. One man stood up to see better until the flight attendant quickly asked him to sit back down. The woman in 16A took a deep breath. She had promised herself this trip would be quiet. She wasn't supposed to get involved in anything. But she also knew what it looked like when an airliner accidentally entered restricted airspace, and she knew what could happen if the wrong signals were sent. Her mind flashed to her secure phone, tucked inside her bag under the seat. It wasn't connected to any normal cell service. It was linked to her Air Force credentials. Even off duty, it could still receive coded alerts if she was inside active airspace. She reached down slowly, unzipping the small front pocket, careful not to draw attention. She pulled out the slim device and checked the screen. A single alert blinked in red text. NORAD alert. Possible unauthorized civilian entry. Transponder discrepancy. Identify if able. Her heart skipped. So it was real. The Air Force had already flagged this plane. That meant the fighter jet outside wasn't random. It was on standby. She stared out again. The jet was closer now, flying parallel but slightly below their altitude, maintaining formation. She could almost make out the pilot's helmet glinting in the sun. She didn't panic. She couldn't. Years of training had built something inside her, a calm that stayed even when everything else started to break apart. But she knew what could come next. If the plane didn't respond correctly, if there was confusion between air traffic control and NORAD, that fighter could be ordered to intercept more aggressively, or worse. She fastened her seatbelt again, her hand gripping the phone tightly. For a long moment, she thought about doing nothing. She wasn't on duty. This wasn't her mission. Someone else was responsible, but then she looked at the faces around her, the sleeping man beside her, the young couple across the aisle, The woman with the book, the flight attendants trying to stay calm. They had no idea how close they could be to disaster, how easily mistakes in the sky could spiral. She couldn't just sit there. Quietly, she stood up, slipping her phone into her pocket. She walked toward the galley where the flight attendants were huddled. "Excuse me," she said gently. They both turned, startled. One of them forced a polite smile. "Yes, ma'am. Please stay seated, we're just waiting for the captain's instructions." "I understand," she said softly, "but I need to speak to the captain." "It's important." The attendants exchanged quick glances. "I'm sorry, that's not possible." She reached into her hoodie pocket and pulled out her Air Force identification card, the metal tag gleaming faintly in the light. "It's official. Please tell the captain it's urgent." The younger attendant's eyes widened. She nodded immediately, then disappeared through the cockpit door. The other attendant looked nervous but didn't ask questions. She just stood there watching. Moments later, the door opened slightly and the captain himself leaned out. His expression was serious but confused. "Yes, Captain?" he asked, recognizing her rank instantly from her ID. "I believe you've lost contact with air traffic control," she said quietly, her voice steady. "You're being tracked by NORAD right now. There's an F-22 flying off your right wing." The captain blinked, stunned. "What? How do you—" She held up her phone, showing him the secure alert. "I received this 5 minutes ago. I'm cleared for identification." For a brief second, he just stared at her, trying to decide whether this was real. Then he looked through the cockpit window and froze. He saw it too, the faint shadow of the fighter gliding beside them. "Stay here," he said, then stepped inside and picked up his radio headset, speaking rapidly. She waited quietly, feeling the air change around her. Every instinct told her things were moving fast now. The captain came back after a few seconds, his expression grim but controlled. "We're getting confirmation. Communications are patchy. They thought we were unresponsive. Our transponder glitched mid-flight." She nodded. "Then we need to identify before that F-22 gets orders to move in closer. I can send my ID code through the military channel. It'll verify we're a civilian aircraft." He looked at her like he wanted to ask a dozen questions, but there wasn't time. "Do it," he said firmly. She took a small step forward, switched her phone to the emergency frequency, and transmitted a short coded message. It was something only a registered pilot with military clearance could do, her personal call sign embedded in the signal. A few seconds later, the reply came through her phone speaker, faint but clear. "Copy that, Valkyrie. Identity confirmed." Standing down, "Safe skies," she exhaled slowly. The tension in her chest eased as she looked out again. The F-22 tilted slightly to one side, a small gesture, a salute. Then it pulled away gracefully, vanishing into the distant haze. She slipped the phone back into her pocket and gave a small nod to the captain. "It's handled," she said simply. He looked at her with disbelief, then relief. "Thank you, Captain." "No need," she said quietly. "Just glad we're clear." When she walked back to her seat, the passengers were still murmuring about the jet, but the panic had already faded. She sat down again, fastening her seatbelt. The man beside her was just waking up, rubbing his eyes. "Everything okay?" he asked sleepily. She smiled faintly. "Yeah," she said. "Everything's fine now." Outside the window, the sky had turned calm again, endless and blue, like nothing had happened. But she knew the truth. For a brief moment, the entire squadron back home had been watching, and they had stood when her call sign came through. She turned her gaze back to the clouds. Quiet again as the plane continued, its steady journey east, and no one around her would ever know how close they'd come, or who had quietly saved them from seat 16A. The air inside the cabin felt lighter after the tension faded. Passengers had started to relax again, convinced the strange sight of the jet outside was nothing serious. Some joked about it. Others tried to guess what had happened. A few even took pictures, not realizing the real story behind what they had seen. The woman in seat 16A didn't say a word. She sat quietly, looking out at the endless blue horizon. From the outside, she looked calm, but inside her thoughts moved fast. Her call sign, Valkyrie, had been silent for months. She hadn't expected to hear it again, especially not like that. Spoken over the emergency frequency by a voice she didn't recognize. It stirred something deep inside her, a mixture of pride and unease. She had left active duty not long ago, hoping for a break. She told herself she needed space, time to breathe, time to just be a person again. But it seemed the sky never truly let her go. As the plane continued east, the captain's voice returned, calm and reassuring. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience earlier. We experienced a brief communication issue that's now been fully resolved. We'll be arriving in Washington on time." People clapped softly, a few even laughed with relief. The sound filled the cabin, warm and human. The woman smiled faintly, but her mind was still half somewhere else. She wondered how the report would look on the other side. In the control rooms, the radar stations, the squadrons watching the screen. She could picture it easily. The flash of her call sign appearing. The sudden realization of who it belonged to. She imagined the voices she hadn't heard in months. The ones who had flown beside her through night skies and sandstorms. The ones who trusted her with their lives. And now, because of one small code sent from a passenger seat, they all knew she was up there again. The flight attendants passed by, offering more drinks. One of them stopped by her row and gave her a soft smile. "Everything okay now?" She nodded. "Yes, thank you." The attendant seemed like she wanted to ask more, maybe about the badge or the quick trip to the cockpit, but she didn't. Instead, she just said, "We appreciate what you did," before moving on. The woman leaned back in her seat and closed her eyes. For the first time that day, she felt the exhaustion settle in. Not just physical, but the kind that comes from years of carrying something heavy inside. She had joined the Air Force young, chasing the sky with every bit of heart she had. The first time she flew an F-22, she remembered feeling weightless, powerful, and small all at once. The ground disappeared and the horizon stretched forever. She used to say that flying made her feel closer to the world, even while leaving it behind. But the higher she went, the lonelier it sometimes became. Being Valkyrie meant control, composure, and precision. It meant being the one everyone depended on when the air got rough. She'd been proud of that, until one mission changed everything. It was years ago, but the memory was still clear. A joint exercise had turned dangerous when an unidentified aircraft had entered their zone without warning. She had been the lead pilot that day. Her squadron moved fast, trusting her commands. One wrong call could have ended it all. They made it home safe. But not everyone walked away untouched. And from that day, something inside her shifted. She had done everything right, yet the weight of what could have gone wrong never left her. That's when she decided to take a step back, to find quiet again. And now, fate had placed her right back where the sky was calling her name. The captain passed by later, stopping briefly beside her seat. His voice was low, respectful. "I just wanted to say thank you again. I've never seen anything like that. You saved us a lot of trouble up here." She smiled lightly. "Just part of the job, even off duty." He nodded. "You still active?" "Not at the moment," she said. "Trying to stay grounded for a while." He chuckled softly. "Grounded? I know how that feels." Then, after a pause, he added, "Well, if it means anything, I'm glad you were on this flight." She nodded in return. "So am I." He left and she went back to the window. The clouds below looked soft and endless, stretching as far as she could see. There was something comforting about them, the reminder that even in chaos the sky always held calm somewhere above it. After some time, she noticed her phone light up again. A new secure message had arrived. It wasn't from the alert system this time, and it was personal. "Nice to have you back in the sky, Valkyrie." "You've still got it." She felt her chest tighten. The message didn't have a name, but she knew who it was from. Someone from her old unit. Someone who had probably seen her code flash on the radar. She typed back a short reply. "Just right place, right time. Hope everyone's doing well." A few minutes later, another message arrived. "They're standing in the control room right now. Whole squadron cheered when your ID came through. You still make them proud." She stared at the screen for a long time before turning it off and placing it face down on the tray table. Outside the window, the sky began to change color as the sun moved toward the horizon. The edges of the clouds glowed gold and pink, painting the air with light. It was the kind of sight that made people quiet. The kind that reminded her why she fell in love with flying in the first place. The man beside her stretched and yawned, then looked out the window too. "Beautiful, isn't it?" he said. "Always is," she replied softly. He smiled. "You fly a lot?" She hesitated for a second. "I used to." He nodded, not asking more, just sharing the moment in silence. As the plane began its slow descent, the passengers started packing their things. The usual noise returned: zippers, chatter, the rustle of bags. Life went back to normal, as if nothing had happened. But she knew better. There was something humbling about it. How close they had come to danger, and how easily it passed without anyone realizing. She wondered if that was how heroes felt sometimes, invisible in plain sight, blending back into the world once the moment was over. When the landing gear lowered, the familiar rumble filled the cabin. The ground grew closer with each passing second. The plane touched down smoothly, the tires squealing briefly against the runway before rolling to a gentle stop. Applause broke out again, just as it always did on safe landings. She smiled, not because of the landing, but because she felt something shift inside her. A quiet realization that maybe she wasn't done with the sky after all. As they taxied toward the gate, the captain's voice came through one last time. "On behalf of the crew, we want to thank you for flying with us today. Special thanks to one passenger who helped us through a rather unusual situation earlier. You know who you are." Some passengers laughed softly, others clapped again. She felt her cheeks warm, but she just kept looking out the window. When the plane stopped and the seatbelt sign turned off, everyone stood, eager to grab their bags. The aisles filled with chatter and movement. She stayed seated for a moment, letting the crowd go first. When it was quiet again, she reached for her backpack and stood. The captain was waiting at the door, shaking hands with passengers as they left. As she stepped off the plane, he gave her a nod of quiet respect. "Take care, Captain. Safe travels, wherever the next flight takes you." She smiled and nodded back. "You too, Captain." Outside the terminal window, she could see another jet taking off, roaring into the pink and orange sky. The sight made her heart stir again. She paused for a moment, standing there with her bag slung over her shoulder, just watching. The world was busy around her, families greeting each other, people hurrying to their next flight, children laughing. But in that noise, she found peace. For her, the sky was more than just air and altitude. It was memory, purpose, and freedom. And even though she had promised herself a quiet life, she knew deep down that someday soon, she'd hear the call sign Valkyrie again, not from a passenger seat, but from the open sky where she truly belonged. At Langley Air Force Base, the control room was buzzing long after the flight had landed. Screens glowed softly in the dim light, showing maps, flight paths, and dots that moved across the sky like stars. Most days, the people in that room worked quietly, keeping the world safe without anyone knowing their names. But today had been different. When the alert came through earlier, the air had changed. A commercial flight, unidentified, possibly off course. The kind of situation that starts with confusion and can end in tragedy if a single call is wrong. Every technician, controller, and pilot on duty had held their breath. They'd watched the radar screens as a small civilian blip moved closer to restricted airspace, escorted by one of their own F-22s. And then, just when the tension was at its peak, a familiar call sign appeared, one no one had seen in months: Valkyrie. It had only taken a second for the room to react. The name echoed through the hall like a spark of recognition. Heads turned. People stood. Even the colonel at the center console stopped speaking mid-sentence. "Did that just say Valkyrie?" one of the younger controllers asked, eyes wide. "It did," the colonel replied quietly. "And unless someone's using it without permission, that means she's up there." No one needed to say her full name. Everyone knew who Valkyrie was. She was the pilot who had once led a near-impossible recovery mission, the one who made the hard calls when it counted most. Some said she had saved a squadron that day. Others just said she had nerves of steel. The room was full of quiet awe, not because of rank or medals, but because of what she represented: calm under fire, precision when it mattered. And now, out of nowhere, her call sign had come alive again from a commercial flight. When the F-22 pilot confirmed her identity and reported, "All clear," the room broke its silence. A few people cheered softly, others smiled in disbelief. Even the colonel allowed himself a rare grin. "She's still got it," he said simply. After that, everything went back to normal, at least on the surface. The alerts were cleared, reports were filed, and the shift continued. But the story of Valkyrie's return spread quickly. In the pilot's lounge later that evening, a group of young flyers gathered, talking in hushed, excited tones. They had grown up hearing stories about her: the missions, the impossible saves, the calm voice over the radio that always seemed to know what to do. One of them pulled up a replay of the radar feed on his screen, pointing to the moment her code appeared. "Look at that," he said. She didn't even hesitate. "Straight identification, perfect timing." "Guess instincts like that don't fade," another replied. They all smiled, but behind those smiles was something deeper, respect, mixed with curiosity. No one had heard from her in months. She had left without a big goodbye, saying only that she needed time away. But to them she was more than a name. She was proof that calm and courage could exist in the same person. Far from that base, the woman known as Valkyrie sat quietly in a small cafe near her hotel, still dressed simply, her backpack resting beside her chair. She had ordered tea again, the same as she always did. The place was quiet, filled with the low sound of soft music and the hum of quiet conversations. Her phone was on the table, dark except for one small notification light, a message she hadn't opened yet. She already knew what it was. A report, a formal one, acknowledging her involvement in the incident. She reached for the phone, unlocked it, and scrolled through the message. The words were official, brief, and clinical. Incident 1047. Civilian aircraft misidentification resolved. Intervention credited to Capt. E. Torres, call sign Valkyrie. That was it. No ceremony. No headlines. Just a quiet note in a digital file that few would ever see. She smiled faintly. That was how she liked it. The sky didn't need applause. It just needed people who understood it. Still, part of her couldn't help but think about the pilot in that F-22, the one who had recognized her call sign, who had tilted his wings in salute before flying off. Whoever he was, she imagined he must have been surprised. Maybe he had even grown up hearing her name the same way those young pilots at Langley had. For him, that moment probably meant something, and for her, it reminded her that even when you think you've left the sky behind, it never really leaves you. She finished her tea, tucked the phone back in her bag, and stepped outside. The air was cool with the faint smell of rain. She looked up. Clouds were gathering again, soft and gray, moving east for a long moment. She just stood there watching them drift. She remembered what one of her instructors had told her years ago. The sky never forgets its own. Maybe that was true. The next day, she was supposed to attend a small debriefing at a local Air Force office, standard protocol whenever a military code was used. She didn't mind. It would be quick, polite, and full of familiar faces. When she walked into the office the next morning, a few people looked up in surprise. Some smiled instantly, others looked almost shy, as if they were seeing a legend step out of an old story. "Captain Torres," one of the officers said warmly, shaking her hand. "Good to have you back in the system, even if only for a moment." "Just passing through," she said with a small smile. They went through the usual paperwork, the questions, the technical details. Everything stayed professional. But at the end, as she was getting ready to leave, the officer leaned back in his chair and said quietly, "You know, when that alert came through and your call sign showed up, you should have seen the room. Everyone stopped what they were doing. You've still got a reputation around here." She laughed softly. "That's probably dangerous," he smiled. "Maybe, but it's earned." She thanked him, signed the final report, and walked out. Outside, the sun had broken through the clouds. The light hit the wet pavement, making it shine. She stood for a moment, breathing in the clean air. It smelled like jet fuel and rain, the kind of smell that always took her back to the runway. She could almost hear the sound of engines in her mind, that deep roar that made the ground shake and the heart steady. Maybe she wasn't finished with that life after all. That thought stayed with her as she walked down the quiet street. A few people passed by, lost in their own worlds, unaware that the woman walking next to them had just saved hundreds of lives the day before. She didn't need them to know. That was never why she did what she did. Later that night, she got another message. This time it wasn't official, just a short text from an old teammate. "Word is Valkyrie's still flying. You should come by the base sometime. The squadron wants to see you." She stared at the message for a long time before replying, "We'll see." Then she turned off the phone, sat by the window, and watched the lights of the city fade into the dark. From her seat, she could see a small red light blinking in the distance, an aircraft crossing the night sky. She followed it with her eyes until it disappeared. She smiled quietly to herself. There was comfort in knowing someone was up there, keeping watch, just as she had done so many times. And though she didn't plan to say it out loud, part of her already knew. The next time the sky called, she would answer. For now, she was content to sit in the quiet. But she also knew that somewhere far above the clouds her name still lived in the airwaves, not as noise but as a memory. Valkyrie. It wasn't just a call sign anymore. It was a promise. A promise to be ready when the world needed her again. And whether it was tomorrow or next year, she knew one thing for sure. The next time her name echoed through the radio, the squadron would be on their feet again. Because once you've earned your wings, you never truly stop flying. The flight that had caused all the trouble was now long forgotten by most of the people who had been on it. Days had passed and life had gone back to normal for them. They were back at work, telling small stories about turbulence or funny passengers, never realizing how close they had been to something that could have gone wrong. Only one person on that plane still carried the memory like a quiet echo, the woman who had sat in seat 16A. After the official report was done, she was free to go wherever she wanted. No one gave her orders anymore. There were no missions waiting, no schedules written in sharp black ink. Just silence. But silence can sometimes feel heavier than noise. She spent the next few days walking through the city, watching the world move. Children ran through parks. People hurried to work. Airplanes crossed the sky above, their silver wings flashing in the sunlight. She found herself looking up more often than she wanted to admit. Every time she saw a plane, she imagined the cockpit, the calm voice of a pilot, the blinking lights, the steady rhythm of flight. It was a world she understood better than any other. Yet for the first time in years, she wasn't part of it. One afternoon, she sat by a small lake on the edge of town. The water was still, reflecting the sky like glass. She skipped a few stones and thought about everything that had happened. The moment she'd seen that fighter outside the window, the fear that she might not be believed, the sound of her call sign echoing over the emergency channel, and the salute. That tiny gesture, a tilt of the wings, had stayed in her mind more than anything else. It wasn't about rank or authority. It was about recognition, a kind of quiet respect that only another pilot would understand. She took a slow breath, her eyes following a line of clouds that stretched across the horizon. It was strange, she thought. Sometimes life doesn't give you a warning before putting you right back where you're meant to be. That night, she received another message. It was from the same pilot who had escorted the airliner that day. He had gotten her contact through the proper channels, careful and respectful. The message was short. "Ma'am, I wanted to thank you. When I heard your voice, I knew we were in good hands. You saved us from making a terrible mistake. I hope one day I can shake your hand in person. F-22 flight lead." She stared at the words for a long time before typing back, "You already did. In the sky." Then she set the phone aside and smiled. A few weeks later, she visited Langley Base again. She didn't go to the control room or the offices. Instead, she walked straight to the hangar, the one that always smelled of metal, oil, and rain. Inside were rows of jets, silent and beautiful, each one waiting for its next flight. The air was cool and still. She ran her hand along the smooth body of an F-22, the same kind she used to fly. The surface was cold to the touch, but familiar. Every inch of it carried memories. Long nights, high-speed chases, moments when the sky felt endless and the heart beat like thunder. A young mechanic noticed her and came over, wiping his hands on a cloth. "You're Valkyrie, aren't you?" he asked softly, almost unsure if he should say it. She smiled faintly. "I used to be," he grinned. "People still talk about you. They say you had the calmest voice in the air. I just learned not to waste words," she replied. The young man nodded, then hesitated. Are you coming back?" She looked at the jet again before answering. "I don't know yet. Maybe the sky isn't done with me." After he left, she stayed there for a while longer, listening to the distant hum of engines outside. It felt like the past and present were folding into each other. The quiet of the hangar, the warmth of the sun slipping through the windows, the faint vibration of planes taking off in the distance. When she finally stepped outside, a familiar figure was waiting by the gate, the colonel she had once served under. He looked older now, but his eyes were the same. Still walking like a pilot, he said with a small smile. Hard habit to break, she replied. They walked together toward the edge of the runway. Neither spoke for a long time. The sound of another jet lifting off filled the air, its roar fading as it climbed into the blue. Finally, he said, "You know, when that call came in, your voice, I think the entire squadron stopped breathing. You might not have seen it, but you had every pilot on their feet." She glanced at him. "I didn't do much," he shook his head. "You did what you've always done. You kept people safe." She didn't answer. There was nothing to add. They stood in silence again, watching the sky open wide above them. After a while, he said, "There's an empty post in the simulator division. We could use someone with your instincts. No pressure, just teaching the next generation." She thought about it. Teaching. Not flying, not commanding him, but guiding. Maybe that was what came next. "I'll think about it," she said softly. "Good," he replied. "The sky needs people who remember what it costs." She nodded, and they shook hands before parting ways. That night she didn't sleep much. Her mind kept returning to the hangar, to the sound of engines, to the young faces she had seen there, all those new pilots who believed the sky belonged to them, not realizing yet how much responsibility came with that belief. By morning, she knew her answer. When she walked into the simulator room the next day, the officers on duty stood a little straighter. No one had expected her to actually come. She looked around at the rows of seats and screens. Each one represented someone learning to fly, to protect, to stay calm when the air trembled with uncertainty. "This place smells the same," she said with a quiet laugh. The instructor beside her smiled. "Machines change, but the feeling doesn't." She sat down in front of one of the simulators and looked at the digital horizon. For a moment she could almost feel the rumble of engines again, the weight of flight gloves, the sound of the radio in her ear. It was all still there, just waiting. Later that week, she began working with new recruits. Most of them didn't realize who she was at first. To them, she was just another trainer. But the moment she spoke through the headset, calm, clear, steady, something changed. They listened more closely. They trusted her voice. And when one of the trainees panicked during a simulated emergency, she guided him through it step by step, never raising her tone, never showing fear. When it was over, he turned to her with wide eyes and said, "I thought I was done for." She smiled softly. "You just needed to breathe." Word spread quickly again. The pilots began calling her Valkyrie in quiet respect. Not as a legend now, but as a mentor who stood among them. And while she never talked about the flight from seat 16A, the story traveled anyway, told in pieces, whispered between training sessions, always ending with the same line. She saved a sky full of people, from a passenger seat. Months later, she found herself walking down the runway at sunset, the golden light painting everything in shades of orange and red. The wind brushed against her hair, carrying that familiar scent of metal and fuel. She looked up and saw a formation of jets flying overhead. Perfect alignment, clean turns, steady rhythm. Her heart lifted with them. It wasn't her in the cockpit anymore. But it didn't matter. They were up there, carrying everything she had once carried. She stopped for a moment, eyes following the planes until they disappeared into the horizon. The sky had always been her home, and though she was on the ground now, she knew she would never really leave it. Somewhere above those clouds, her call sign still lived, not as an order, not as a legend, but as a quiet reminder of what it means to stay calm, stay kind, and keep others safe, no matter where you sit. Seat 16A had just been another place in the world, but in that moment it had reminded her, and everyone who knew her, that sometimes the sky finds its way back to you when you least expect it. And as she walked back toward the hangar, she whispered softly to herself, almost like a promise, "Valkyrie never really lands."